All right, let's get started. No? I guess not.
I'm ready, Ricardo.
I'm ready. I'm waiting for everyone else.
Ricardo, don't you think that Michael should get us all brownies?
Sure. Yeah, that's recording, right?
Permutation, do both, just like this lecture. How about I sit in here and cheer?
I'll bring my pencil.
Who's here for the Afterlab? Everyone? Or just like this group? If it's just this group, let's go downstairs. Anyone else? Afterlab? Okay. Alright, so today's Afterlab is going to go over using the permutation to effectively beat the critique. Now, I'm going to go over a few things of how you currently debate the permutation, what might be wrong with it, how it should be debated, and how you can effectively use it in the 2AR, in the 2AC, the 1AR, all those speeches, to make it something that is a stronger 2AR and a stronger ballot against a critique. So how do you debate it today? I hear this 2AC block that just reads a bunch of permutations. 1, perm do both. 2, perm do the plan in all other instances, which I don't know what it means. 3, perm do the alt, because the alt's super abusive, and I learned here at MSU that I have to say that as a theory argument. 4, perm do the plan and reject in all other instances, something we've already said, but for some reason gets read in 2AC blocks anyways. Would you say this in a counterplan debate? So include the last 3. You might say perm do both, right? You're probably not going to say perm do the counterplan in all other instances. Why do you do it in a critique? I don't know. So let's talk about, before we get too far in, let's talk about what a complete argument is. A claim, a warrant, and an impact. So perm do both has maybe a claim. A more effective way to phrase it is perm do both. It solves a link to the criticism because it does the alternative. That overwhelms the residual links to the plan. You might have heard this as a perm double bind. That's a claim, warrant, and an impact. Now, there's a few more effective ways to deploy this. I think it's a pretty strong argument, and one of the stronger ones you learned here at this camp. Just saying do both isn't a complete argument. When you're on a counterplan, you shouldn't just say do both. You say do both. It solves a link to politics because, well, China might overwhelm and seem more popular. It's easier with states where the states shield the action. It looks like Obama is not being committed. There's a lot of reasons why it might not link to politics. I would say there's a stronger reason why it solves the sphere of influence is sad, but that's a different lecture. How the perm should be debated. You'll almost never win the argument that doing all other instances is super convincing. The reason is when the judge at the end of the round asks for, when they're deciding whether or not the permutation is something they're going to vote on, they ask for something called the text of the permutation. Now, if you just hand them plus all other instances, they're immediately going to think this isn't a very credible argument. Now, if you said something like, perm do the plan and incorporate knowledge of the Southern conceptions of economic engagement, that might sound like a more convincing text that's a complete idea and has a reason why it might solve the residual links of the affirmative. Well, whenever you do something that's more than the status quo or more than the plan, you add something, it needs a net benefit. Why is this? Anyone? Who's familiar with the idea of what presumption is? So you always presume towards less change. You have the status quo, which is nothing. It's what's happening right now. And then you have the plan, which is change. And then the alternative comes in. You can argue that there's more change to the plan. So now the affirmative gets to argue that you should always presume towards less change. The permutation does both. And doing both is more change than either the alternative or the plan. So you have to have a reason why it is a good idea or why you should prefer it over simply the alternative. So you need a net benefit. What can the net benefit be? Well, you just have to look at what the alternative doesn't do, which is usually the AF. If they start doing the AF, it's a floating pick, and 1, gives more credibility to some of the arguments that you solve the residual links, and 2, it's pretty abusive and you should be reading some theory arguments. Most judges, if you answer it and answer the reason why the floating pick has no solvency applicate or has no really basis in this debate, you'll probably win that it's not something that they should have. There's a few other useful arguments to add, and a few other useful threads in this type of permutation debate, is that a lot of the arguments you make on the permutation also go into whether or not the alternative solves. Now, K teams are going to do one of two things. One, they're going to argue that the ballot is some kind of rejection or some kind of necessary action in order to take a stance against whatever they're criticizing. Or 2, they're going to say that we should reject every instance of whatever they're criticizing. One is super easy to win, that it doesn't solve because it doesn't solve the other instances. This is where uniqueness arguments are very good to make in conjunction with the permutation that you're making. Or this is a good instance where if they start backing down and saying that their alternative pretty much does nothing, you get to start making arguments that their alternative doesn't solve the link to the status quo. It doesn't provide uniqueness to the criticism, which is what the purpose of it is in the first place. Otherwise, the status quo is doing things that are pretty bad for neoliberalism, for instance. And those are the useful arguments, how it should be debated. I want to get into an example of effectively deploying the perm against the neoliberalism critique that's right at this camp. Now, I'm going to read some text, and you tell me where it comes from. Such a perspective does not eliminate or deny knowledge convinced in Europe or North America, usually named as universal or its proponents and thinkers. Instead, it incorporates such knowledge as a part of a broader canon and worldwide that seeks pluriversality, recognizing the importance of places and loci of enunciation. On one hand, there are those challenges that many face in Latin American contexts, the real difficulties in financing, infrastructure, and research support. On the other hand, are the challenges that come from traditional academic disciplinary structure, its depoliticization and desubjectification. Here, the challenge is to transgress the established norms of neutrality and the sense of the objectivity. These challenges, together with the tensions, criticisms, and disputes that they mark, oftentimes make the path more difficult. Still, at the same time, they allow us to clarify distinctive and unique aspects of our project and its motivations to continue with its course construction, insurgencies, and struggle. Better yet, in a much broader fashion, we are concerned with the epistemic interculturalization with the decolonization and polarization of university and the thinking from the South. Does that sound like a good card for a permutation? Why? What parts was I emphasizing? Anyone? The part that says there might be some tensions between these types of scholarship, but it's good to look at both in order to create a more effective project. Now, you'd be surprised to say that this comes from the underlined part of the alternative evidence in the neoliberalism file that is put out at this camp. It's highlighted in red, and it should be uploaded already because I accidentally downloaded it, and it's saved. It's the first page. You can look at it if you don't trust me. The reason I'm doing this and reading this part of the card is that you should always read the alternative evidence and every part of the alternative evidence for areas that either A, ask for more broad action, or B, talk about the status quo and how it can be incorporated with the criticism in order to create better knowledge. Why is this useful? When you're making a permutation that you should do the plan plus whatever the warrant of the alternative, which this alternative specifically states that we should incorporate conceptions of the South. When you're doing that, when you're making that permutation, making that argument, you have an advocate for it, which is their text. Now, what's the first argument people are going to make against this permutation? It's intrinsic. Good. Well, one, here's what the text of the permutation or the tag says. Vote neg to interrogate neoliberal economic engagement with Latin America from the starting point of knowledge production. Now, if there's a counterplan that states we should not do the plan but then do something else, which is pretty much what this is doing. Can't you do the plan and do something else and that's not intrinsic? It takes all of the plan and part of the counterplan or whatever the alternative is. So that's a pretty quick answer to intrinsic plans. But if they just say vote neg or do nothing, which is something that's not really advocated by the alternative text, the alternative card, you get to make different arguments. Now, with the critique, they like to look at your 1AC and point out what authors are saying things that they might be criticizing or might be suspect. These are types of representation arguments where you have to defend your representations. Why don't they have to defend the text of their evidence? That's the argument they're making when they're saying that the permutation is intrinsic. They should have to defend the text of their evidence too, and you should be able to make arguments based off prescriptive claims of their evidence. You should be able to make permutations based off prescriptive claims within their alternative evidence. You could probably find some stuff in their link evidence too. But the best way to find good evidence against a critique is within their own evidence, which is the point I'm trying to get to. So, you're up against Neil Libke. They're saying you should vote neg. I think in cross-sects you should start pointing out some of these underlined parts, how they say we should combine these types of scholarships. And the 2AC should sound like this. Perm, do the plan and incorporate knowledge of the South into conceptions of economic engagement. The Perm solves. The warrant of the alternatives that we need to incorporate different perspectives of neoliberalism into scholarship. Their Walsh evidence is a solvency advocate. Look at cross-sects. Or read that underlined part. Why is this more effective? It's got a claim, a warrant, and an impact. It's different from do both. It's different from do the plan in all other instances. Now, you need to take it a step further as you get deeper into the debate. They're going to say a few things. They're probably going to read the per block. And in there, they say, one, it's either severance or intrinsic. It's not severance. It does the entirety plan. It's not intrinsic. We covered that earlier, that you get to advocate on underlying parts, or you get to talk about text within their evidence because they get to talk about your representations. They'll say solvency deficit. One, your solvency advocate is from their alternative evidence, meaning that this is enough to overcome the residual links of the plan. This new form of interrogation is useful. That's what their evidence says. Two, even if they have some residual link or some nuanced link, some nuanced scenario, the permutation solves the reason why we would use this type of neoliberalism to justify conflicts or justify looking at people as no longer human or dehumanizing people. So it solves the impact. This argument's very important. The permutation solves the impact. Why? They're probably going to win a link. The permutation is like defense. But if you're able to win, that those links don't matter because it solves the reason why those links would lead to the impact, you're probably going to win a net benefit, and you're probably going to win that the permutation's a better option, or you should vote AF because you have net offense. So, Perm solves the impact. Something you should always have in your 1AR. It's a pretty quick argument. And the way you phrase it is that it solves the reason why we would use whatever they're criticizing to cause bad things, like environmental degradation, or dehumanization, or otherization, or constructing conflicts. I found this to be a pretty effective strategy my last year of high school when I was dealing with security K a lot, which is why I'm sharing it. So they say no net benefit to the permutation because the alternative solves the entirety of the act. One, this isn't true. The alternative is to vote negative. The alternative says that we should look at new conceptions of economic engagement. The alternative doesn't provide assistance for Cuba, or assistance from the U.S. to Cuba, doesn't create new oil rigs, doesn't maybe trade off with LNG if that's the way you're taking the affirmative. The point here is that you have more specific solvency evidence. They don't have a solvency advocate for rejecting neoliberalism, changing things. They might have some evidence that you're able to remedy warning by changing the way we look at economic interactions or changing the way we decide to go about consumption. But that's a different story, and that's something that permutation probably solves. And it's probably also more action than the affirmative, meaning that you probably get presumption with the permutation. So, point being, they don't solve the F. Another key argument you need to make. And the other side of it is that you need to be pointing to specific advantages that are external to these link arguments that they're making or these terms that they're making and argue why those mean that the permutation is net beneficial, or the argument that you're making is net beneficial. You need a net benefit to the permutation. There's almost always more change in the affirmative. It's always more change in the alternative, meaning that it's very easy for someone to vote on presumption if there's nothing. So you always need to remember your affirmative, which is the best offense in any debate. You started off with 8 minutes of it. Sorry, college times. They say it's intrinsic. It's not intrinsic. It does parts of the text that they provided. It's not intrinsic. It does parts of the alternative evidence they provided. If you don't believe me, open up the file that's online. There's some red text. Someone already opened it over here, so it definitely saved. Now, how do you go about this in the 2AR? You should have a few framing questions. One, if you think the permutation is sufficient to solve the reason why we justify conflicts, or the reason is the permutation sufficient to solve the impact, you don't ask because there's a risk that wars will happen, the environment will collapse. Whatever your affirmative is, whatever the impact is. This is no different from a dissad. This is no different from a counterplan debate. There is a solvency deficit, and that solvency deficit outweighs the dissad. So your AF is the solvency deficit, your AF outweighs whatever the dissad portion of the critique is. Now, you should also plead to the judge that you're making an argument that's different from just do both, or just reject all other instances, which is what their blocks or the arguments that they read will usually assume. So these arguments are different. This permutation actually has a text. It's actually a complete argument that you started from the 2AC, and that should have some credibility. Now, at worst, you reject the permutation, it's a test of competition, and you weigh the AF against the critique. Why is this important? It probably still outweighs if you're winning that you get to weigh the AF and you haven't dropped any of their K-traits about valuing life or whatnot. Or it turning the case, or you looking at a certain ology first. Make sure you answer those. Are there any questions about this section? No?
Can you re-explain why what argument you would make for the determination of the impact?
It solves the impact because it solves the reason we use neoliberal ideologies, or it solves the reason why economics would overwhelm our drive to stop an oil spill from happening. It solves the reason why we use those bad ideologies to do bad things.
Okay. It's like sufficient.
Yeah. Or it's the security K, which is an easier example. It solves the reason why we would use the otherization of China to justify conflict against them. Because we're questioning whether or not that conflict is necessary in the first place.
Yeah.
Because we're changing our conception of how we view war, or we're changing our conception of how we view enemies. So even if there's a link or a scenario based off of China that's specific to the AF, it solves the reason why that scenario specific to the AF would happen in the first place. So what else should be in the 2AC? You always need a framework argument. The point here I'm getting, you obviously need like alt doesn't solve, maybe some offense against K, maybe even some impact terms. But you shouldn't just read all of your permutations at the same time and hope the judge gets them down and think that they're credible. Usually with any argument, the more of the same type of argument that you have, the less credible it gets in their mind. If you start dumping a bunch of theory arguments, you start to sound like you're just trying to spread them out, and they start to get the groupness. If you're making a bunch of permutations, one, they'll make this silly multiple Perms bad argument that is going to win like 1 out of 100 rounds, but it's still going to be there. Two, it's going to sound like you're just dumping as many permutations in the debate to try to get them to spend time on it. You should always make arguments that you're willing to go for in the 2AR and the 2AC. If it's something that you're just putting there that make them spend time on it, it probably doesn't belong in your 2AC. And you're probably more well off reading an add-on with that time or figuring out something else to do with it. Just like if you're negative, you would never read a dissat you don't plan on going for, or you would never read a spec if you don't plan on going for it. Every argument's important. So why do you read perm to the alt and hope they drop it? Right? It might be a convincing argument that these things are unpredictable and they change all the time. But I think it's predictable enough when you can read their evidence and figure out exactly what it's doing. These cards almost always, with the exception of ones that say absolutely nothing, which those are different debates that you're getting into. And you can probably say that the permutation doesn't solve, alternative doesn't solve. But almost always, these things are going to call for action. Call for action to change whatever they're criticizing. And these calls to actions are very different from doing nothing. The Zizek card people like to read for do nothing, which I don't know if that's been phased out now since it's been a while. But that card states that we should actively resist every form of capitalism. That's very different from doing nothing. And you can actively resist in every other instance and do the plan. A lot of the security king cards talk about changing the way we view war, or changing the way we conceptualize the justifications for war. You can do that with the affirmative. Perm double bind is a very effective argument. Now, if they're starting to back off and say their alternative is not that big, you have to make another argument that it does not solve the link to the status quo, or it doesn't provide uniqueness. You should always use this as leverage. If you can tell that this is pretty much what they're going for, and they're going for something that pretty much does nothing and doesn't solve, you're probably better off going for case outweighs and using that as defense. You probably don't even need permutation of the 2AR. You should always keep this argument alive. It's a no-risk option. You're almost never going to lose on the fact that you read a permutation, unless you drop an argument that says intrinsic perms are bad. But hopefully you're flowing, you're not going to drop those arguments. Even if you drop it, unless you're in front of Scott Phillips or other judges that think drop theory arguments are a voting issue, you're probably not going to lose because it has to be a complete argument. And most of the time it's not. So it's a no-risk option. It might take 30 seconds to get through in the 1AR as a complete argument. You can maybe even make it faster. In the 2AC, you don't have to spend much time on it. The tagline I said, which I think is a complete argument, if you want to say it's not, my feelings won't be hurt. That took me, speaking very slowly, maybe 10 seconds. It's quick, effective, and provides a lot of mitigation against a critique. It's great defense, really fast, if you want to call it impact defense. So you should go for it. Now, what if you're reading an AF that clearly links to the K? Like, they're reading the security K and your AF is, we hate China, we need to kick them out of the region, they need to be out of here forever, we should probably go to war with them soon. Which those AFs will probably exist. There's going to be an AF that's like 8 minutes in China, you know it. Well, I would say, 1, your security K block should have a lot of hedge good in it. 2, the permutation still is useful here because it provides defense. You can make arguments like, even if we're a hardline AF that's pretty much the example of pointing out China and creating a conflict with them, the permutation is a step in the right direction towards changing our scholarship towards China, and there's still a reason to prefer doing both because there might be war. And hopefully if you're reading this type of affirmative, you have a lot of evidence that your research or methodology behind the research is true, and that China is a real threat. I don't know how Russia's going to get worked in this topic, but they probably are. You got to do the same thing. It's defense. You always need defense if you want to outweigh something, unless there's a clear mismatch in impacts. But they're almost always going to read extinction is inevitable, or some type of extinction impact that goes with it. So you need defense. Perm solves the impact is another argument that's useful here. That's pretty much all I have prepared for this. Are there any questions? I know this is a shorter Afterlab.
Ricardo, Is that video going to be up?
Yeah, it's going to be posted.
I'm a little confused about like terms I have this. So like for example, if you have like the cube oil and if you were to read like the China counterplan, but like without an FNF.
Okay.
And you said firm do both. So there's like no FNF for the term, but
Okay.
for the counterplan.
Well, that's a different instance, right? So you're saying they don't read in that benefits of the counterplan, which the first thing you should say is presumption, because the counterplan is more change. But you're also testing competition on the counterplan, so you still need a reason to prefer it because it's more change. Think of it that way. You always have to hedge against the ballot of you vote neg on presumption because neither side has a reason to prefer either thing, but the alternative is less change, and the negative gets presumption. You're right that they give up the right to presumption, and you can always say like it's a reason to reject the counterplan. But when you're deploying a permutation, you're making a permutation on the K, you're almost never using it to test competition. You're using it to mitigate the link, right? Because saying like Perms do the counterplan, you usually say that because the counterplan is clearly plan plus. Right? And that's, I guess, where the Perms of the alt comes in, the test of computation of the alternative. But the argument's a little bit different. Other questions?
Where's the file thing?
It's in evidence and lectures. That's where it got saved.
How do you feel about like going for a I guess a better question is like under what conditions would you say that would be
A permutation is never an advocacy. It's always a test of competition.
So you don't think you can ever go for a Perms and advocacy?
Well, I think when people say they're going for the Perms and advocacy, they're saying it's a better option than the alternative or the ad, which is what I've talked about for the past, I want to say, 15 to 20 minutes. So saying it's an advocacy, I would say, is almost providing a false tagline to the same arguments. Now, if you always have the option, the reason why it's a no-risk option is that you always have the option to refer back to the affirmative, refer back to the status quo. Meaning that under this type of theory, you don't give up the option to have an affirmative. So meaning that you still have the client text as your advocacy, and you're still testing whether the critique is competitive or not. Other questions? Any questions generally about? I could go a little bit into counterplans or end it early. Any preference? I think that could be a discussion for later. I think it's 10:45. It's about. I've gone through pretty much everything I want to go through. If there's anything you get out of this lecture, is that you should always read their evidence before you get up and speak. Just like you always read a counterplan text before you get up in the 2AC and speak, you should always make sure you're making complete arguments, and you should stop making so many permutations when you only need one or two to win the round. You're just going to get grouped later anyways. Come on. All right, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I'm in the office.